Okay, hello everybody. We are up to 15 people. That seems to be the number that we always start with now, and then we end around 23, 24. That's been going on for the last few weeks. I'm just going to go ahead and open this up in prayer, and then we will get this show on the road. Dear Lord, thank you so much for bringing us all here tonight. Thank you so much for this incredible resource you have, and I pray that we all be reminded that despite everything that's going on around us, political misgivings and fears and all of that stuff, that we just are gently reminded that you are sovereign and you are in control of everything that's going on. And I pray that we can receive from you tonight. We can be a blessing to you, and we can receive whatever blessing Tony would have for us in your son's name. Amen. Take it away, Tony.
Romans 9, and it's really interesting, the timing of us being in Romans 9 with everything that is going on in our country right now. And if I could say, if I could point to one chapter in the Bible that kind of gives voice to Romans 9, it would be Psalms chapter 2, which says, the people of the earth gather together, and the kings of the earth plot a vain thing. They say, let us cast off their bonds and break their fetters. But the one enthroned in heaven laughs, and he mocks them in derision and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed on Zion, my holy hill, my king. And this is Psalms 2, talking about God's sovereignty over the nations. And what we are seeing happen in our country right now is exactly what Psalms 2 was talking about. The kings of the earth and the people are plotting a vain thing. And what is that vain thing? It's to break the fetters and cast off the chains of God. And how are they doing that? They're doing that by refusing to accept that God is sovereign. They are doing it according to Romans 1, suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. And so what's God's reaction to all this? We can sometimes get fearful and we can sometimes get frustrated. But what is our reaction to this? Well, what's God's reaction? What does God do? It says God laughs. He laughs. He sits back on his throne in heaven, and he looks down on men and the kings of the earth, and he laughs at them because they're so futile. Everything wicked that these leaders of ours are plotting in their hearts, it will all come back to shoot them in the foot, because God is in control. And so I just really think that what's happening in our nation right now is very germane to what we're experiencing or what we're seeing in Romans 9. And I just think that I just find it interesting that the timing of this lesson, as we know, God controls all things. If he controls the nations, he can surely control the timing of our Bible study, right? So I just want to encourage you with that, and encourage you and remind you that what's going on here in Romans 9 is Paul is expressing God's sovereign election as it has to do, or has as it relates to the nations of the earth. And we went through a few things. Pat, how far did we get last week? Do you remember? Did we get to 14 or?
We got to 15. Actually, we got to 14. We're starting on 15, I think.
Okay, we did get to 14. Okay. So we talked about the sovereign spiritual blessings of Israel. And Paul kind of sets all of this up going, look, Israel had every blessing that you would think a nation would need to have in order to embrace the truth. But just because you have all these privileges doesn't mean that you're going to embrace them or appreciate them.
Excuse
And
me,
he
Tony,
talks,
my
yes,
mistake. We did 15 to 24 last week.
we did. Okay,
Yeah.
that's fine.
Okay.
That's fine. I thought maybe that we had done that, so that's good.
Yeah.
So we went through Pharaoh. Did we talk about Pharaoh last week? So he begins to use examples. Now, again, let me remind everybody that the context of this conversation of election is not about so much about individual election as it is God's sovereign election of the nations and how God deals with the nations. And so we gave some examples of that. Some of the examples that we gave of that was Ishmael and Isaac. Okay, here, Paul starts like on the outer fringe of the covenant and works inwards towards the center of the covenant. He talks about Ishmael and Isaac, the difference between the slave, the son of the slave or the law, and the son of the unconditional promise of the Abrahamic covenant. And then he moves further into this covenantal circle when he talks about Esau and Jacob, both children of the covenant. Yet God, breaking with tradition, ignores the older and makes his covenant with the younger. And it's really important to realize that this has nothing to do with their personality, because let's be honest, if you look at their personality, Jacob was kind of a liar and a deceiver, where Esau had his issues too, but he was more of an upfront, hardworking kind of guy. And, he was honest with who he was, whereas Jacob was a little bit more, he was a usurper. Okay. So this is not about God favoring Jacob because of his personality. It's not because God favored Jacob because of any decisions that he made. God made the decision to keep Jacob, or to make the covenant with Jacob, to display his sovereignty. If each one of us here thought about, well, gosh, if we're talking election, why would God choose me? Well, he wouldn't. But God's election has nothing to do with your personality or your good works or anything. It has to do with his mercy. It has to do with the work of Christ. So I think that's really important to understand. And he makes that point when he says that, God's choice of Jacob had nothing to do with their decisions, because they hadn't done anything before they were born. So why did God do it that? Well, he did it to display his will. God, when we look back into the Old Testament, and this is Paul's point to the Romans, that the old, and he says it again, I think in Corinthians, he says, look, the things that happen in the Old Testament, these are things that God did to teach us now a lesson. So they were done for a purpose back then, but they're also done for a purpose now. And that is to understand that God is sovereign over the nations. No matter how the nations think that they are in control. China is doing everything that China is doing to be manipulative and deceptive and whatever, but it's not going to profit China a thing. What God wants for China is salvation. That's what, and by the way, part of the temptation of getting wrapped up in the politics, okay, because we have to realize something. All right, well, let's step back from America, from China, from all these countries. And what you realize is that there are a few thousand very rich, very powerful men who control the world. And that most of your people in China are helpless victims of their country, of those oligarchs. So we have to be careful not to villainize or allow hatred in our heart for a people because of what their government is doing. But remember that we are what? Ambassadors for Christ. That's what we are. And that what our job is, no matter how much we may disdain the behavior of those in our government and in other governments, we should have a broken heart for the lost, for the billions, let me say that again, billions of poor, starving people around this world. And so we get caught up in these other few people who control things, and we forget, and our heart grows hardened against the billions of lost and suffering people in this world. And so we've got to remember that. We can't forget about that. Our heart needs to be the same heart that God expresses when he says, pray for all men, for God desires all men to be saved. So that's important. So then we move on to we talked last week about Pharaoh. And hopefully I made a really good case. And I think Pharaoh is probably one of the best examples of how God's grace works and how God's sovereign election works, in that Pharaoh hardened his own heart by continuing to suppress the truth and unrighteousness, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart simply by allowing him to do so, and not giving him the grace to see the truth, but allowing him to continue in his sinful, willful rebellion against God. And I think that probably if there's any character in the Bible that helps us understand what does it mean for God to harden someone's heart, what does it mean for, election, it's Pharaoh. Because we watch in Exodus as Pharaoh hardens his heart 5 times, and then God hardens his heart 5 times. And God tells Moses, go to Egypt and say this to Pharaoh, but he won't listen to you because I'm going to harden his heart. And so how does God do that? Well, we know that James 1 says that God does not make people sin, and God doesn't tempt people to sin. All right? He doesn't tempt people to sin. So it's not passive. In other words, God doesn't make Pharaoh say no to doing right. God simply doesn't interfere with Pharaoh's sinful, depraved nature. It's really important to understand that, to understand God's grace and election, how these things work. So Pharaoh is completely responsible for his decisions. And some people will hold on. God asked Pharaoh to do something he knew Pharaoh wouldn't do. So isn't God tempting Pharaoh to do evil? Okay, this is horrible logic. I am not tempting you to do evil if I ask you to do the right thing. God was asking Pharaoh to do the right thing. That's not tempting someone from evil or to do evil. That is simply saying, do the right thing. And Pharaoh chose not to. This is very different from Satan in the garden, who's lying to Adam and Eve, saying, do this thing. And God saying, no, this is the truth, Pharaoh. Do the truth. And Pharaoh rejecting to do the truth. It's very different. One is accepting deception, the other is denying the truth. And the reason I bring this up is because I think it'll be important when you talk to people regarding this issue of temptation, of hardening of heart, of grace, and so forth. They may bring up this argument. Well, now hold on. God tempted Pharaoh by asking him to do the right thing. Well, no, you're not tempting someone to do wrong by asking them to do right. You're actually tempting them to do right.
Tony, I have a question.
Sure, Fiona.
So the Pharaoh, he could hear the God say you need to do right. Did he hear? Can he hear the God saying?
Yeah, well, he heard the message, right? And God, now look, if I came into your home and said, look, I have a message from God, and you said, well, how am I supposed to know that? And I said, okay, turn on all your faucets, and blood pours out. Not red water, but blood. You might go, oh, maybe something's up. So God provided Pharaoh with proof. It's also important to understand something, okay? All of the plagues, the 10 plagues that God did to Pharaoh, all of them hit an individual god of Egypt. Each plague was not, it wasn't random. Each plague was aimed at a particular deity that Egypt worshiped. God was showing Pharaoh one by one by one by one that he had power over all the deities of Egypt. These plagues weren't random. They were, Pharaoh knew every god that was being overwhelmed and overcome by God, Jehovah. And still, he wouldn't do the right thing. So God provided Pharaoh with very practical truth and evidence, proof. So on the rational, let's take grace aside from this. And on the rational realm, reasonable human realm, God provided supernatural proof to Pharaoh that he was stronger than all his gods, which Pharaoh, if he was a reasonable person, said, oh, I better listen. But he didn't. Why? Because he suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. Okay? Super, super important. I really want to land on Pharaoh and beat this into us, because this whole interaction with Pharaoh and Moses and God really just reveals so much to us on how the human depravity works and how God's grace and election for the nations works. Okay, because all the people we're talking about here, these are all fathers of nations. Okay, Esau became the father of the Edomites. And what's very interesting, who was an ungodly king of Israel. And he went to war with the Edomites. That's Esau's. So they went to war with their own brothers, as it were. And you know what he did when he defeated them? He took their idols, brought them to Jerusalem, and worshiped them. How stupid is that? God gives him the victory. He goes in and takes these useless idols that could not protect the Edomites and brings them to Jerusalem and worships them. But before we judge too harshly, and this actually interesting, our pastor here in Woodland, Washington, Scott LaPierre, who by the way has a lot of really good books out. You look up his last name, LaPierre, Scott LaPierre. He's got some really good books out. But he was talking about this Sunday, and he said I thought he did a really good job of connecting how we as Christians today take the idols of this culture that are defeated and worship them anyway. Money, whatever, I don't know, think about whatever it is, money, wealth, or security, or whatever. But it does have something to say about today. So anyway, again, the context of this is the nations. So now he moves from Pharaoh, from these nations, and he says this. I don't know if did we cover the passive and active aspect of God as the potter and the nations as the vessels? Did we talk about that last week?
That sounds familiar, so I would say yes.
Okay, then I won't go over that again. He says, even us whom this is verse 24, even us whom he also called, not from among the Jews only, but also from among the Gentiles. He says also in Hosea, I will call those who are not my people, and her who is not my beloved, beloved. And it shall be that in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called the sons of the living God. So, okay, what's going on here? Paul is taking the story of Ishmael and Isaac, the son of the law and the son of grace. And then he takes the story of Esau and Jacob, two sons of the covenant, one rejected, one accepted. And then he takes Pharaoh and Moses, two nations, Israel and the Gentile world. And what does he say? Hosea says this. Now listen. Hosea says this. One day the children of Ishmael, one day the children of Esau, one day the children of Pharaoh will be called the children of God. God wasn't doing these things with Ishmael and Isaac to reject the salvation of Ishmael. He wasn't doing these things with Esau and Jacob to reject the salvation of Esau. He wasn't doing these things with Moses and Pharaoh to reject the salvation of Pharaoh. No. He says, Hosea says the children of Ishmael will be called the sons of God. The children of Esau will be called the sons of God. The children of Pharaoh will be called the sons of God. You see what he's doing here? What he's saying is that God protected the line of the Messiah from Isaac to Jacob to Moses. God protected the line of the Messiah, not just to save Israel, but to save Esau, Ishmael, Pharaoh. We have to understand this. This is hugely important, because if we don't understand this, then our heart as Christians won't break for every unbeliever out there, no matter what race or culture or ethnicity. We have to understand that Jesus Christ died for all nations. And so Paul takes this and he funnels it down to Hosea. And he says, but hold on. And why is he doing this? Because he knows the Jewish Christians have to understand that their purpose as Jews was not to be superior, was not to be the elite. Their purpose of Jews was to produce a savior for all of mankind, not just for them. It's huge. It's super, super important that we understand where Paul is going with this, because it does affect how your outlook for our culture in our country right now. It's not about America. It's not about China. It's not about Russia. It's about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And perhaps maybe one of the best things that can happen to us as Christians is that we get so separated or told you're not welcome anymore in American politics, that we finally stop worrying about that and start worrying about the gospel. Maybe it'll work to our good for our country and our culture to kick us to the curb and tell us that our voice isn't appreciated anymore and our opinion is not wanted. So we'll stop worrying about politics and start worrying about people. We've been given the Great Commission. Look, nowhere in the Great Commission does it talk about voting and does it talk about politics. And don't get me wrong, I'm, not Mr. Sovereign Citizen or any of that crap. What I'm talking about is having a right perspective. I will go and vote for someone who will protect the unborn, who will stand against unrighteousness, but I'm not going to put my faith and my hope in this country or in the Republican Party. My faith and my hope are in the gospel of Jesus Christ alone. And so I may treat myself to a discussion of how disgusted I am regarding, liberals in this country, but that's a passing conversation. It has no real weight to reality. The thing that matters is when I look an unbeliever in the eye and tell him about Jesus Christ. That's the thing that has eternal benefit to it. So we need to have a proper perspective, and I think we need to have a proper balance where at some point, even Moses came to a point where he said, I'm not wanted in Egypt anymore. I'm leaving. It is just that. I just think it's very tempting for us to be drawn into these issues. But what really needs to dominate our mind and our heart and our soul is the kingdom. Roxanne and I were out doing, I had 2 jobs postponed on me. So I got 4 days off this week and I'm like, Yahoo. And so Roxanne and I were out running errands today. And I was just telling her, I said, I feel a little bit aimless because I don't feel like I'm doing enough for the kingdom. I don't want to get so wrapped up in my life that I'm more worried about bills and garbage like that and politics, and that the lion's share of my energy and my thoughts and my life are not being spent on the kingdom, because that's why we're here. And so I do think that if anything's going to happen, there'll be a wake-up call to true Christians. Well, they'll have to shed a lot of this stupid, superficial stuff and start having to really be concerned with the kingdom and what Christ has called us to do. So I think that's really, really important. So Hosea funnels all of this down to make, and Paul uses Hosea to make the point, like, look, guys, this is not about Jew or Gentile. It's about both. Jesus came to save the Jews and the Gentiles. And then he goes on, he says in verse 27 of chapter 9, verse 27, he says, Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, it is the remnant that will be saved. For the Lord will execute his word on the earth thoroughly and quickly. Just as Isaiah foretold, unless the Lord of the Sabbath had left us to posterity, we would have become like Sodom. We would have resembled Gomorrah. What is he saying here? This is a strong message to the Jewish Christians. He's saying, look, do not, basically, here's what he's saying. Look, don't put your faith in being a Jew. Because Isaiah says that only a few Jews will be saved. Not only that, Isaiah says, if it wasn't for the grace of God, every Jew would be like Sodom and Gomorrah. So don't put your faith in being a Jew. That's the point. The whole point here in chapter 9 is that God actively changed the heart of people like Jacob, like Abraham, like Isaac, in order to bring the birth of Christ about. And he passively, he actively allowed people like Esau, Ishmael, and Pharaoh to continue in their sin. But he did this not out of cruelty. He did this to bring forth the Messiah, a salvation for both Pharaoh and Moses, for Esau and Jacob, for Ishmael and Isaac. And so he's telling the Jews of Rome, look, you guys, put your faith not in your Judaism. And so he comes down to the end of chapter 9. It's very important. He says, what shall we say then? It's verse 30. What shall we say then, that Gentiles who did not pursue attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith? But Israel, pursuing the law of righteousness, did not arrive at that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as it were by works. They stumbled over the stumbling stone, just as it is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed. So what is he saying? Here's what he's saying. Here's what he's saying, okay? There are two great truths concerning God's sovereign election. One, the Gentiles arrived at salvation through faith. The Jews missed salvation because their faith was in the law. The difference here is that righteousness comes only through Jesus Christ, whether you're Jew or whether you're Gentile. The difference is that righteousness must be imputed. It can never be earned by ethnicity, by rules, by actions, by your own will, or by any decision that you make. So chapter 9 is revealing to Jew and Gentile alike that God's work in history had nothing to do with their race, their culture, their actions, their character, nothing. Everything God did in history, he did to bring about the birth of his son for the salvation of Ishmael and Isaac, of Esau and Jacob, of Pharaoh and Moses. Period. End of chapter. And now we can go into our question time.